Hello, I'm Tiff Roberts, Director of China Affairs at the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center. Welcome to tonight's dialogue, China's Global Influence Activities, Growing Threat or Failure. Our speaker is Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia, Joshua Kurlantzick, and our moderator is Radio Free Asia President Bay Fang. The Mansfield Center's mission is to foster a national dialogue of respect and civility to restore trust in our national institutions, our founding documents, and our public policy makers. Our dialogues are designed to foster civil exchanges of ideas from diverse viewpoints, reinforce the importance of democratic institutions, and examine the role that ethical values play in public life. In my newly created role as Director of China Affairs, I focus on three areas: expanding our China education footprint, doing research on China and US-China relations, and welcoming more China speakers to our dialogue series, as we have with us and we will hear from momentarily. Tonight's topic is particularly important as China increasingly extends its influence globally by becoming a media and information superpower, and sometimes working hand in hand with Russia to try to influence domestic politics and elections in countries around the world, including the United States. We've had more than 265 people register for what clearly is a compelling and important topic. Please note that our speakers will address our viewers' questions. So you had an opportunity to submit those earlier, but if you have not done so, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. I'm honored to introduce this evening's moderator, Ms. Bay Fang. Bay Fang is president of Radio Free Asia, where she oversees award-winning journalism with a mission of bringing free press to closed societies in Asia. A former bureau chief for News and World Report, US News and World Report in Beijing, China, which is actually where Bay and I met many years ago. She also has covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She has the added perspective of having served in the government under the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary of State for Press and Public Affairs. She earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard and was a visiting fellow at Oxford. She's trained as a French chef at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris and holds a brown belt in Kung Fu. Bay, thank you so much for moderating tonight's dialogue. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tiff, for that kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be here tonight. I think this will be a fascinating conversation. Josh Kurlantzick and I actually also worked together over 20 years ago when we were both at US News and World Report, back when there were international bureaus, and but he's been a good friend since then. He is a senior fellow at CFR, and he has this amazing new book out, which is so comprehensive, called Beijing's Global Media Offensive, China's Uneven Campaign to Influence Asia and the World. And so, Josh, thank you for joining us. I wanted to start by
thanks for having me.
Yeah, I just wanted to start with basically the scale, the breadth of what China is doing. And can you just tell us briefly about what the scope is of China's influence and information activities globally? And since this is something that always shocks people, given the sort of relatively paltry sum that the U.S. spends on these kinds of operations globally, can you just tell us how much money China spends on it every year?
Okay, well, that's a lot packed in. In the book, I try to talk about 5 different ways in which China uses information, media, and influence around the world. There's state media, which is media that's controlled by the Chinese government, and which they have built up and spread around the world, opening bureaus around the world. And that includes China Global Television Network, which is sort of their global state TV network, China Radio International, which is the radio version of that, and Xinhua, which is the Chinese news wire. There's no real, there's no real one number I could tell you about how much China spends on media, information, influence, and soft power efforts. But David Shambaugh, who's a pretty well-known China scholar at George Washington, estimated a few years ago that they spend 15 billion, which I'm sure you'd love to have that budget at RFA. But I mean, one of the reasons that that number is so large is because for all the good work RFA does, the US has a free press. And so the US accumulates soft power at the best of times in ways beyond simply state-funded media like RFA, including the US's private or publicly held, but not government-controlled media, et cetera, as well as a whole range of other things ranging from music to Hollywood to LeBron James to whatever. So there's the state media. Then in the book, I talk about how China has increasingly gained control, and we can talk later about the state media, what's effective, what's not. My view is that most of the big state media are not very effective, except for Xinhua. China has been extraordinarily effective at taking over the Chinese government, I should say, the Chinese language press in most countries in the world, such that there are very, very few independent Chinese language media outlets anywhere left in the world that offer Chinese language readers, viewers, listeners, particularly readers, independent coverage of China. There are a few in Southeast Asia, in Taiwan, a few holding on in the US and Canada, but in most places, including the US, there really aren't. So China has been very successful at co-opting the local Chinese language media and shifting it to pretty much a pro-Beijing or at least agnostic stance towards Beijing. The third thing I talk about at length is China's increasing use of the internet in a variety of ways. One way is simply a much more sophisticated over the last few years use of disinformation on major tech platforms, including all the ones we'd be familiar with here in the United States, Twitter or X or whatever, Facebook, Google, YouTube, etc. All of which, unfortunately, are at the same time reducing their ability to filter out disinformation, including state disinformation. China is also quite active on social media platforms that are primarily used either based out of China, like WeChat, which is a social media, which is like a super app based out of China, but which can be used all over the world. They're quite active on other Asia-based social media platforms and messaging apps like Line and others. A couple of years ago, their use of disinformation was pretty clumsy, and in fact, it backfired repeatedly. It was very easy to identify as compared to, say, Russian disinformation, which was much, much more sophisticated because Russia had probably a longer, much longer experience in such disinformation. But China's gotten a lot more sophisticated in disinformation online. So I talk about that. And then just briefly two final things. China has increasingly stepped up its game in what I would call old-fashioned influence. And the reason I call it old-fashioned is because it's basically it's the type of influence that could have existed 60 years ago or 100 years ago, et cetera, for the most part. And that includes paying politicians, either directly in some cases, like, or using funnels to pay politicians, spending lavish amounts of money on research institutions, think tanks. I should say at this point that CFR does not take, and the Council on Foreign Relations, where I work, does not take any money from any foreign government, and we don't take any money from the US government either. Or they use old-fashioned influence tactics like using diaspora communities to pressure people who are critical of Beijing, using those communities within elections to as a block to apply pressure, old-fashioned espionage, using aspects of the Chinese intelligence services to threaten people. And then finally, the last is an increasing effort to wield power or to wield influence on university campuses all over the world. That's become a very big issue, as has the one about wielding influence over elections. But there has been a very strong push to shift to foster self-censorship at university campuses all over the world about Beijing, and to make ethnic Chinese students, whether they're actually from China or they're just simply ethnic Chinese from wherever, including nationals of that country, like they're watched and like there is pressure to toe a more pro-Beijing line. You'll notice that one thing I did not mention was TikTok. I know we already have a lot of questions about TikTok, which is obviously a social media platform based in China, and which is a source of quite a lot of controversy in the US, in Montana, et cetera. But I do talk about it in the book, but I figure I'd leave that for later because I've already gotten, I think, 3 written questions about it. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's really interesting. Especially the Chinese language press in globally. I actually use the example of my parents who have lived here since the 60s when they came for grad school, and they've been consuming the exact same Mandarin like newspapers that they get at the grocery store and the TV channels. And it's only been in the last like 6, 7, 8 years that their views have, they are obviously getting Beijing propaganda. And that's a relatively recent thing. So a lot of people, so given the subtitle of your book, a lot of people think that we've lost the information war with China, but you suggest otherwise. And you actually, in your book, you start with the example of Malaysian elections that China attempted to influence, but didn't succeed in doing so. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the ways in which China's had success and, and what types of influence you feel like have not been as successful.
Sure. I mean, I don't think the United States, I mean, we have a lot of our own problems, but I don't think the United States has lost anything in relation to China at this point. I don't like using the phrase generally war, simply because there is the not impossible prospect that we might actually go to war at some point with China, but with real war. But I think that there's 2 things. One is that China has, and I talked about I was talking about it and writing about it, but now it's become even more obvious. China has a huge amount of their own problems, which were not apparent to people saying 5 or 7 years ago that, China was going to become the dominant world power and was going to surpass the US in GDP even GDP per capita at a certain point. Instead, Xi Jinping has killed off quite a lot of what made China so dynamic and so potentially threatening in some ways, although also bolstering to the world economy. China is now in the midst of sort of like its own 1970s style malaise, where the private sector, he has really suffocated the private sector, which is the main provider of jobs and an economy. He's suffocated the arts and any dynamism. And he's driven a lot of the richest people out of the country, as well as a lot of the people who are providing capital. Now, you may not have sympathy for them, but per se, but they're a lot of the ones who are funding new companies. There's huge graft and corruption scandals, and it's reverted to, instead of the sort of collective leadership that existed in the post-Mao period, where it always was an authoritarian state, but decisions were made in general by a small group of men, to be sure, but it was made especially post 1989, in a more predictable way. And there was also much greater freedom in the 90s, 2000s, when you lived there, even up into the 2010s. And that freedom, no, you couldn't go out in Tiananmen Square in 2008 and hold up a placard remember those who died in 1989, but you could, there were some independent media outlets. You could build your own internet company. There was a vibrant music and art scene. There was a fairly substantial environment like that. And he's killed all of that, and that, as well as the demographic problems that China has, and the fact that youth unemployment is so high, China is actually confronting now its own massive problems. So I don't think the US has lost generally to China. In terms of the specifics of influence or information, I think there are things that China has done well. One of them is Xinhua. Xinhua has been very effective because it's a news wire. And as a news wire, it gets picked up by news outlets all over the world, including some in liberal democracies. And its stories make its way into the bloodstream of news in a way that China's TV and radio networks do not. And most readers of newspapers, online news sites, frankly, although we would like to think otherwise, don't really pay attention to who writes the story or where the story comes from. Maybe with a few exceptions, like if Bob Woodward writes a story or whatever. So Xinhua has expanded, and China has signed content sharing agreements, and Xinhua has proliferated, particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe. So they've been successful with that. They've been successful, as we said, with the taking over the Chinese language media. But overall, I mean, I think still you see that their other state media outlets are very have very low viewership and listenership numbers. Actually, I obtained those by FOIAing your overall employer, US AGM, during the course of this book, where they provided me the studies that Gallup does for you, or for USA, for the parent of Radio Free Asia, et cetera, which showed very, very low viewership of China's state media in virtually every country of the world. And I think that China's own sort of brand in media and information is not really trusted. Xinhua is going in the back door. People are consuming it, which is not great because it's essentially a propaganda organ, but they're consuming it without really knowing about it. But the actual brand of the Chinese media is very, very low. And I think that there was an attempt in the early Xi Jinping era and in the late Hu Jintao era to make China's state media more credible, to make it more like Al Jazeera, where it was based, it's based in an authoritarian state, and so Al Jazeera is not going to produce credible stories about Qatar. It's not going to produce credible stories probably about issues related to Qatar, but there aren't that many issues related to Qatar in general. And so they actually poached a lot of reporters from Al Jazeera as well as from CNN but it's simply impossible for, you can't compare it because so many stories can be related back to China. It's not a tiny little, you know, tiny little country that doesn't have much weight in the world. And then that combined with Xi Jinping just crushing, you know, basically all free media, led the state media to go back to being incredibly turgid and propagandistic. Then you combine that with just much more belligerent diplomacy. And by diplomacy, I mean the actual actions of their actual diplomats in the last few years, as well as just a shutting down from the world that started with their zero COVID policies, but has continued. It's interesting that you talk about that Tiff or Dexter talked about, you know, boosting, you know, education about China. Well, when you were living in China in the 2000s, there were 16,000, 18,000, I don't know the exact number, US students studying in China at at Hopkins Nanjing Center and a bunch of other places. And now there's like 400 left, something around that, I think almost all at NYU Shanghai, which has been allowed to stay open, and maybe the Schwarzman scholars. Most of the foreign journalists have been kicked out too. So China is enforced a kind of self-isolation from the world, or at least from much of the world, or a fair amount of the world. And that hasn't helped their image either. If you look at China's public image in a lot of, virtually every liberal democracy, plus a lot of its neighboring states, which aren't liberal democracies, it's quite bad right now, which may be why Xi Jinping is considering going in a different direction and trying to build a kind of alternative order, world order of him, Putin, and a series of other states. I think that's fated to fail, but yeah, I think China's influence, I think we in the United States tend to fluctuate in dealing with our primary adversaries, or at least competitors, and this happened with the Soviet Union too, from thinking that they are like incredibly powerful, like they're going to overwhelm us, to at times thinking they're extremely weak. And we often don't have a middle place where we can recognize that they can be strong in some ways and weak in other ways, and they're not necessarily, you know, going to dominate, et cetera, indefinitely.
Got it. Yeah, so I'm curious, in the course of writing this book, did your views change at all about China's information and influence activities?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I think I give a shorter answer here. I think it changed in a lot of the ways that I kind of just laid out here. I mean, I started by thinking about it related to Southeast Asia, where China has made a lot of progress, frankly, in soft power and in getting its control of the local of the Chinese language media, which really matters because in a number of those countries, there's a very large population of Chinese speakers, and where China had gotten a lot of success in dominating or playing a very substantial role in local politics, and is also by far the dominant investor and trading partner. And so I actually did kind of start out thinking, China is going to build this information superpower. And this was around the same time that China was still, this is before COVID, China was still doing phenomenally economically. Xi Jinping hadn't really dropped the hammer on the big private sector companies. Like, he hadn't disappeared Jack Ma. For those of you who don't know, Jack Ma is probably China's best known business person, and founded Alibaba, which is one of China's leading global companies. And when he obliquely criticized Xi Jinping's policies, he just vanished for a period of time a few years ago. So I think I was of the view, actually, going in, that China was building a very successful both information apparatus and influence apparatus. Around the same time, there started to be revelations that China was being very successful at influencing the politics of Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And as I did more research and looked into it more, I started to be, so we started out probably with, I don't really remember with Oxford, but we probably started out with a much more hawkish subtitle or title. And that the more that I looked into it, it became more nuanced, which I think is good. That's what research is supposed to do. And I became more doubtful. And so I returned to the position I said before, which is they've done some things well and some things not as well. And that sort of nuance is often not well picked up in US foreign policy, particularly not, I'm afraid, in congressional policy, which in my opinion is now, and I'm pretty tough on China, but now congressional policy is now kind of gone off a little off the rails on China, in my opinion.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And what do you think is Xi's goal in building up this whole influence?
Well, to separate the information, like the state media and the disinformation, at least the state media, I think originally his goal was to try to gain China what they call greater discourse power on the world stage. Like, he was angry that a lot of stories about China, a lot of information about China. Chinese leaders have long been angry about this, but he was the first to sort of openly express it and try to do. A lot of stories about China, a lot of the way China is portrayed is defined by, and is still defined by, media outlets based in liberal democracies. So much of the image of China portrayed to the outside world is defined by the New York Times or like the Yomiuri Shimbun or the Guardian or whatever, you know. We could name like 10 other outlets based in liberal democracies. And they felt like Xi Jinping and other leaders felt like that was not fair and didn't reflect what they thought of China was or is, and they wanted media outlets that could push back against it. I think that was the genesis of that, although that mostly failed. With the influence, I think the genesis is more that they want to directly intervene in other countries now to shift diaspora communities and politics in a way that is, least, if not pro-Beijing, is agnostic about some of the things they do, or just is quiet about things like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, Taiwan, etc. In terms of why Xi Jinping has destroyed much of the private sector, killed the arts, etc., the reason for that, I think, is that the lesson, and there's been quite a lot written about this, but one of the things that he has said to other party leaders, and that's been documented, and one of the things that he has repeatedly come back to many times, is that he's very closely studied the failures of the Soviet Union, and that to him, I'm not a Sovietologist, but to him, the Soviet Union failed because it made mistakes at the end and opened up and did not remain essentially Leninist enough, harsh enough. And he is not going to make that same mistake. So he is going to put the party above everything else. And that is why the party, after years of an ideological retreat by the party, there has now been an ideological, quote unquote, I guess, reawakening, in which, you know, private businesses, tech companies have to spend hours studying party stuff, studying Xi Jinping's, you know, incredibly boring books of thoughts, and the party hasn't been inserted much more aggressively into universities, media outlets, virtually everywhere. And I think, again, the genesis of that is he thinks that that's a way to maintain control indefinitely, either by the party or by him himself. He's already breached the informal limit of 2 terms and may seek to be in office for quite a long time. So I think that's the reason why you see this really intense, isolating crackdown inside China. You're on mute, Bay.
Sorry. How would you say the US and other countries should respond to this?
To which, the crackdown in China, or the information, or the influence, or what?
The influence.
Well, I mean, I think there's different things. I think that in terms of the Chinese language media, the US and other countries, let's just step back a second. There's nothing that anyone can do, or that the US should be doing, if some US citizen, whether they're a Chinese national or not, buys up one of those papers that your parents have been reading, or et cetera, and fires all the independent editorialists and hires a bunch of people who want to write that, Xi Jinping is, a man of the century and it's nothing but brilliant thoughts. You can't do anything about that at all. We don't want to be in the business of telling American citizens who buy news outlets what they can or can't say. That's an obvious First Amendment violation. So to some extent, there's some things you just simply can't do. In terms of the Chinese language media, there are some things that can be done. One, foreign investment in media and information companies in the United States and in other liberal democracies, foreign investment either by overseas companies, and they don't have to be Chinese, they could be Norwegian, need to be scrutinized with the same level of scrutiny that one would apply to, in the past, things that were specifically dual use military technology, like, I don't know, steel, or things you can make missiles out of, et cetera. The same level of scrutiny should be applied to major purchases by foreign investors, individuals, companies, et cetera, of major media and information outlets in liberal democracy. Secondly, I think, the US government has a limited amount of foreign aid, but the US government and NGOs should spend money on independent Chinese language media in places where it's desperately needed. Some of those places include Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand. I mean, donors could spend money in the United States, but in other places in Southeast Asia, there's been a huge retreat from China, so I don't think it's possible in China anymore. But spending money on independent, and I don't think it's possible in Hong Kong anymore either, but spending money on independent Chinese language media is, I think, something that should be focused on. In terms of the disinformation aspect, we're going in the wrong direction. So I don't have a good answer for that. I think one answer to that is to have more effective content moderation on major tech platforms. But that's not only about China. I mean, that's about everything. I mean, China is spreading some disinformation on US social media platforms, but the vast majority of disinformation on social media platforms is being spread by Americans themselves about all sorts of things having nothing to do with China. And following Elon Musk's lead, all the major tech companies are essentially abandoning content moderation, unfortunately, right before a presidential election. So I don't have an answer for that. We're going in the wrong direction. I think schools in the United States and other countries should put a priority on digital literacy, and learning what's accurate online and how sourcing works. Both of my children go to a Quaker school here. I live in Baltimore, and my older son has had several classes where he's 15, has had several classes where they have learned about digital literacy and how to tell a false from a real source, but that should be a priority in every classroom. And there are countries that have made it a priority: Finland, Taiwan, even Italy. We often think of Italy as a place that is disorganized and chaotic, but they actually have developed a fairly robust digital literacy program. In terms of the straight up influence, like paying politicians, wielding influence over elections, funding research institutes, etc. I think every US university and research institute should look twice at who they're getting money from, particularly foreign donors, and think about who those foreign donors are, what strings come with them. I think it's easy to say that since we don't take any money, but I mean that should be thought about very specifically, and not only related to China. I mean, should you be taking money from Saudi Arabia? Should you be taking money from? We could go through a long list. In terms of the influence over politics, like for example, there's a scandal that's been brewing in Canada for months now that China may have directly influenced the 2019 federal election, which is like their national elections in Canada, by inserting operatives into the campaigns of multiple conservative, not conservative with a small c, but the Conservative Party, several MPs' offices. That just needs to be two things. One, there needs to be better education of people below the rank of the executive branch, state and local officials, about Chinese influence efforts. There was a great story in the Associated Press about 2 months ago about insane influence efforts in Utah with state legislators, where China was wielding all sorts of influence. There were state legislators who had consultancies in Shanghai while they were also working as state legislators in Utah. And Senator Romney became so concerned, he organized a briefing for a number of state legislators about how they were being influenced by China, and they just kind of blew them off. While at the same time, we need to recognize that in the past, some of these efforts, like the FBI's China initiative, which was started in the late 2010s, turned into something that went beyond simply just looking for political influence, and just turned into sort of a wide-ranging, way too wide-ranging search for espionage, in which a lot of people of Chinese origin got caught up in. Most of the cases were dropped because the FBI didn't really do a good job with the prosecution, or they simply were targeting people because they were of Chinese origin. It's hard to tell from case to case, but it developed into a very broad, just sort of sweeping net, and we don't want that either. So it's a fine line to walk. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn to audience questions because there are quite a few. There are a few questions, as you indicated earlier, about TikTok, and basically whether China is exerting any political and security influence on US politics via TikTok. And yeah, just generally what your thinking is about the TikTok controversy.
Sure. So Okay, so TikTok is parent company ByteDance is based in China, even though the CEO is technically based in Singapore. The Communist Party essentially has one seat on the board of ByteDance, but one seat is enough for the Communist Party to have influence over ByteDance. No one else on the board is going to go against the Communist Party's seat on the board. There is evidence that at times TikTok employees have looked through people's social media accounts, and that information has flowed back through China in ways in which it's not supposed to. On the other hand, there's tons of examples of tech companies in the US doing the same thing. And let's not forget that the United States had a massive operation to spy on allies and partners all over the world, including the cell phone of the Chancellor of Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to say that, we are above reproach either. But the fact that it's a social media giant, the fastest growing, the one that most popular with younger people, that is still based in China, and the parent company has a seat given over to the Communist Party, is inevitably an untenable long-term position with a lot of liberal democracies, including the United States. Now, I don't think that right now China is using TikTok to dramatically affect US politics for several reasons. First of all, it's a lot harder to control and insert disinformation onto than, say, Twitter. B, TikTok is so much more chaotic in how it's used that it would be harder to. And I want to say about the Montana lawsuit and the other state lawsuits, I don't want to impugn Montana or any of the others. I do think that there needs to be a resolution of TikTok, but I don't think Montana or any of the other states is going to win. I think at a federal court, and if you bring it to the Supreme Court, is going to say that the decision needs to be made by Congress and the executive, and it's not a decision that, because foreign policy is generally almost always on an issue of this importance given over to the executive and to some extent to Congress. I suspect that Montana and the other states that are supporting it are going to lose in federal court. Now, that doesn't mean that TikTok should continue to operate as it does in the US. I think that ultimately the Biden administration needs to negotiate a solution with TikTok where either they can have all the data stored in the US, which TikTok is saying it's doing or is going to do, but with verifiably able to do that with no possibility the information can leak out. Ideally, that would be done by hosting it on servers from another company only. Or if that's not possible, then ban TikTok. But Joe Biden does not want to ban TikTok before the 2024 election, right? There's a political imperative as well, right? The Democratic Party is a conglomeration of a number of blocks. It's not as unified as the Republican Party in terms of where it draws its votes from. And one of the critical blocks is people who are between the ages of 18 and 30. And there's no way that Joe Biden wants to ban their TikTok right before the election when he desperately needs their vote. And he's already sort of struggling with them. So you have to throw that into the mix too. But eventually there needs to be some solution that keeps the data on US soil, the same way that I think such a solution will need to be worked out in the European Union, in the UK, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, etc. It simply can't, it's not tenable this way. The level of trust is not going to be there unless you can work out a solution like that. or else you ban it. But that's not happening before the presidential election.
That makes a lot of sense. So one question that came in is, what are some viable options to address disinformation and free speech rights? I can tell you what RFA is doing, but I'll let you answer it first.
Well, you can tell us what RFA is doing.
Well, so we actually just created something called the Fact Check Lab. So we try to address disinformation coming out from China in real time. So everything from, one of the most recent posts that went viral about the Maui wildfires. There were there were posts that came out of China saying that it was caused by a US weapons test. And there was a video to go with it. And so we did a reverse image search and some video forensics, and we found that it was a town in Kansas that had these electrical fires, a number of years ago. That was the actual video that they're sending around. So it's things like that. But and we work with other fact checking sort of platforms because they're starting to proliferate. But it's something that is really important to do, and we can only do so much as we have manpower, but every little bit is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly some other outlets are doing that. It's interesting you mentioned that. I had a long conversation with someone from the BBC about a week ago. It wasn't a private or off the record conversation about how they are setting up a large China disinformation center, which it's the BBC, so their resources are probably significantly larger, where they intend to both report on China's disinformation activities and fact check some of them in real time. And she was talking about what they were building up. I mean, I think that helps. I think China and any other autocrat or anyone is able to take advantage of the organic level of distrust that has built up among Americans about everything. And the fact checking by RFA or any other good organization, while valuable, and I'm not saying it's not valuable, China's ability to spread disinformation is much greater, and your ability to get fact check out that people believe is much less than it would have been 5 or 7 years ago, simply because the level of distrust of the media, plus the level of just disinformation and chaos, just all about everything on all the major tech platforms, has given an opportunity to all sorts of problematic actors, including, unfortunately, China. I wish I had a great answer for that. The focus of the Biden administration also seems to have mostly given up on pushing for, I guess RFA gets funding from Congress, and you can call that the government, but the Biden administration, the executive branch, seems to have mostly given up on sort of pushing the tech companies for better moderation, and seems to have switched their focus in terms of anger at the tech companies, which is shared by many Republicans, switch their focus more to antitrust issues with Google, with Amazon, which isn't exactly which isn't a social media platform, but is a tech company, or it's a tech company. It's a giant whatever. I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think as long as there's no content moderation and we have all these massive social media platforms and no one trusts each other and they don't trust other people online, it's very hard to get any sort of accurate information. You can direct people, but I think for it to work, the United States has to have a very substantial amount of money devoted to teaching digital literacy from a very young age, and take it seriously as something that needs to be addressed from kindergarten on, because I think, with 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, et cetera, the level of polarization and distrust is so high, I'm not sure you're going to get a lot of those people back ever.
Yeah,
I'm
totally.
sorry to be so negative.
No, I totally agree. And that's actually something that the Mansfield Center is working on as well, the media literacy piece of it. So a related question is, do Chinese citizens have access to verifiable international news? Does the Chinese government filter what news Chinese citizens have access to, which is very much so the answer to the second question.
Well, the answer to the second question is for sure. I mean, China has a heavily walled, monitored, and filtered internet. So with most foreign media sites blocked, although there's you'd have to remind me of I think it's called blockedinchina.org, but I'm not sure if that's it. I know CFR, our organization, is blocked in China. And Radio Free Asia is obviously blocked. You have to get around it, and they do all sorts of things to try to stop your frequencies, right?
Yeah.
So no, they don't. There's no open access. And one thing I was mentioning before that no longer exists is back in the 90s and 2000s, there wasn't a free and independent media in China, but there were some outlets that did quality reporting on some issues. There was outlets that did quality reporting on some social issues. There was outlets that did good environmental reporting. There's outlets that did very good reporting on problems with financial issues, and even some that moved close enough that they did reporting on corruption, although some of them moved too close to the flame and got in trouble for that. And almost all of those outlets, I think all of them are gone, basically.
Mhm.
So that sort of internal independent reporting, although not complete, has also been shuttered. Now, for Chinese citizens seeking to access foreign media, there are ways, but those ways have also been constricted very heavily compared to the 90s or 2000s. One, like I mentioned, many more foreign sites are blocked. So if you're in China and you and you're just using a regular, you're just on your computer, the site won't load. It'll look like there's an error. And the list of those sites has gone up quite a lot. And is well beyond like thinking like, oh, it's just the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's like huge numbers of foreign media sites. Secondly, it's become much harder in China to use a remote server. It used to be a lot easier. It used to be pretty easy in the past, and the penalties for being caught using a remote server are much more severe than they used to be. So savvy people can use a remote server, and some are, but they're running a remote server. In other words, they're accessing a server in Japan or Australia or et cetera, and using that to read news or do whatever they want via this server that takes them outside of China and is connected to a server in Australia or Japan or US or whatever. But doing that, one, requires a greater level of technological knowledge than in the past, and two, you run a much higher risk of being caught and punished than in the past. Same thing for using some kind of virtual private network. So it's possible. And information also filters in on WeChat, which is, like I said, a super app, but is very much an enormous messaging service for people within China, but also for the Chinese diaspora community. And although WeChat is very heavily monitored and filtered, so that anytime anything pops up on WeChat that's in any way critical of the government is very quick to shut it down. There are WeChat groups and some information about the outside world that isn't necessarily so political does filter in, but overall, the amount of information that filters in is much less than it was 10 or 15 years ago. that also allows the Communist Party potentially to shape the narrative more, although the last couple of years of bad growth and the disastrous COVID policies and the just sort of blandness of the Xi Jinping era has undermined China's narrative. But yes, it's harder and harder to get foreign information.
Okay, and last question from Joanna, another board member. How has China managed to co-opt or control Chinese language media in other countries? So all the different mechanisms.
Well, there's several ways. I mean, in some cases, Chinese state firms or individuals who do a lot of business with Chinese state firms, and this is or do a lot of business with China. This is particularly prevalent in Southeast Asia, have bought up the titles, the news titles, and made them more pro-Beijing, because that will give them more opportunities, business opportunities in China. So that's one way. A second way is, and this has happened in Australia and some other places, because China is a very large market, and has both a large consumer market, but also a lot of major global companies. They threaten Chinese news outlets, which tend to be pretty small. You know, you're not talking about the BBC or CNN. They depend on shoestring revenue. They threaten to pull advertising unless outlets take at least an agnostic line towards Beijing. So that's happened in Australia and some other places. A third way, like I mentioned about the US, is whether or not it was instigated by Beijing, you simply have some more pro-Beijing tycoons buying up some media outlets and changing them. I don't know whether that was necessarily instigated or simply those people bought up the outlets and canned the independent reporters. A fourth thing that's happened is that one of the major conduits of Chinese language media around the world historically has been Phoenix TV, which is based out of Hong Kong. And Phoenix TV was never some like beacon of, you know, adversarial reporting, but 10 or 20 years ago, and Phoenix TV is widely available in packages in most places where there are large numbers of Chinese speakers, including it's available in cable and satellite packages in the US, based out of Hong Kong. And in the past, Phoenix media was more independent. It wouldn't necessarily slam Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, but there was a much more nuanced coverage of China, including things that walked up to the line of really truly independent reporting. And Phoenix media now, which is a very, very substantial portion of the overall pie of Chinese language media consumed overseas, is now just another pro-Beijing, completely pro-Beijing, just lackey. I don't know what the better word is for that than that.
Well, on that happy note, we will.
Well, I don't have a lot of happy news for you.
No, we will have to end the event there. But thank you so much, Josh, for this awesome conversation. And
Thank you.
And thank you to the Mansfield Center. Good night, everyone.